Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to give everybody a few more minutes to come on board, and we'll start the session at about 12:02, 12:03. Thank you so much for being here. We're really excited to have this conversation today. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're so excited to see you here. It's wonderful to see the participant list get so high. We're gonna start in just a few minutes. We're just letting a little more folks come to the table. We know everybody's getting their lunch ready, so we're gonna get started shortly. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon at this point. We're going to get started in just one more minute. Thank you so much for being here. All right, so I am going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for attending today's session. We're so excited to have you here. We're so excited to have this conversation. My name is Nissy New. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Metro Dallas Homeless Alliance. We really were, when we were thinking about building out the series for this year, we kind of wanted to reimagine what our communities would look like. For so many of us, we experienced so much loss last year due to COVID-19. We had shelter in place, we had quarantines, we had just a very different lifestyle and not the community that we were really used to. So in this year, as we reimagine what our lives would look like post-pandemic, we wanted the opportunity to build that conversation. What kind of community do we want to build? So in our 7th year of the Hard Conversation series, we're going to be kind of discussing that with many, many different individuals and key leaders around the country. And we encourage you and invite you to join all of those discussions. So it's a 5-part series. And the other big thing is that we can't do the work that we do without wonderful sponsors. So we're excited and really proud to have the Apartment Association of Greater Dallas be the presenting sponsor for the Hard Conversation series. So at this time, I want to let Ian Mattingly, who's the current president, come on board and share a few words. Ian is the president also of the Luma Residential, a private multifamily investment and property management firm based in Dallas and with communities across Texas. So here we go. Ian, I'll let you start.
Thank you so much, Nissy. Since our founding over 60 years ago, the Apartment Association of Greater Dallas has been committed to supporting the rental housing industry in all its aspects and geographies, including supporting many of our member companies who work with organizations throughout the continuum of care and in the hard work to solve homelessness throughout the Metroplex. And that's one of the reasons why we're so pleased to sponsor this year's Metro Dallas Homeless Alliance Hard Conversation series, and why I'm especially excited to introduce today's special guest, Anne Miskey. Anne has been a nonprofit leader and outspoken advocate for nearly 20 years and is currently the CEO of Union Station Homeless Services in Pasadena, California. Union Station's a leading homeless service provider in Los Angeles County and a leading advocate for people who are threatened by or living with homelessness. And today, Anne will be joined in conversation with Dr. Francois Booker-Drew, who is the Vice President of Community Affairs and Strategic Alliances at the State Fair of Texas. And they are going to be discussing the theme we're focusing on in this year's Hard Conversations, as Nissy mentioned. What kind of community do you want to build? So with that, I will turn it over to the doctor, and thank you so much for the opportunity to sponsor this phenomenal event.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I am excited to be here with you all and have a conversation with the amazing Anne Miskey. Anne, it's just been wonderful learning about you and about your work. And so I'm looking forward to us delving deeper into what does it look like to build the community that we want to live in. And so I want to start with your background. How did you get into this space, leaving corporate and then deciding that this was an issue that was important for you to become involved in?
Hi, Francois. It's such a pleasure to be here today. Thank you, and thank you to all of those who are listening in. So yes, I started out in the corporate sector and worked there for many years, and then came a point in my life where I said I want to do something that feels like I'm really making a difference to folks out there. And I got into the nonprofit world, and honestly was very, very frustrated. I was working with passionate, smart, compassionate people, but in a system that didn't seem to be very effective. It was kind of putting band-aids on the problem. And frankly, a lot of that was because the way things were funded. They didn't have a lot of choice. And I remember thinking, we're just kind of going around in circles here. It's not that we're not helping people. It's not that we're not making a difference in individuals' lives, but we're not seeing any major changes in some of these social issues. And I actually got into the work around homelessness, not because I was sort of focused on the issue, but I started to see some approaches happening around how do we get to the root of this? How do we really make a difference and actually end homelessness, not just for one individual, but end it in the whole, in our entire community. And that drew me in. It was more the model around how do you look at solving real problems. And once I got involved there, then I became really passionate about the issue because I realized that homelessness is one of the biggest crises in our country in this century. And we haven't done a good job, and we're seeing more and more people become homeless. So that was kind of what drew me in, and what I'm passionate about now is not just continuing to help the individual, which we have to do, and that family who's fallen into homelessness, but how do we get behind what's causing it, and how do we really fix the problem?
And then you talk about the Band-Aids that keep people in poverty. So talk a bit more about what that means and really delve into the lack of coordination that contributes to this issue, because we know in this space that there are a lot of folks that are doing great work, but sometimes there's the disconnect in terms of resources being available and working together. What's been your experience in that?
Well, again, if we look at the homeless sector and people experiencing homelessness, what we hear a lot, and we're seeing it here in Los Angeles where we have a huge crisis, is, oh, it's all about the individual. So it's because they made bad choices. It's because they have addiction. It's because they have mental health issues. Everybody thinks that everybody who's homeless out there is mentally ill or is addicted, which is not true. So again, we put it on that individual. And then what I mean by the Band-Aid is, yes, we may help, again, that individual, maybe get them into some kind of program. We absolutely want to get them into housing. But then we go on and we don't ever go, wait a second, there are lots of people with mental illness and most of them are living in housing. There are people with addiction and they're living in housing. They're not homeless. So what is the correlation? So rather than just say, okay, yeah, it's all this issue and we're going to have a treatment program and there the problem is solved, that's not working. And again, you're right, the lack of coordination. And this is one of my pet issues and pet peeves, is we have created such broken systems, and we expect the people who are the victims of these very systems to then jump through multiple hoops to try to fix themselves. And so the system is causing their problem, is broken, and then we're saying, but you got to do all of these things. And if you can prove yourself and jump through these hoops, then you're worthy of getting help. And just one example that kind of shows just one thing is the Gates Foundation. This was up in Seattle, did some research about families who were on the verge of becoming homeless because of job loss. You know, the rent just skyrocketed, all of these things. And so they found out, what did it take for that person to get help? And they found out that that family made a minimum of 32 phone calls to 32 different agencies, government agencies, et cetera, to try to figure out what they could do to prevent becoming homeless. And at the end, they gave up. And I'm going, can you imagine if you needed your refrigerator repaired and you had to call around to 32 different places and everybody said, yeah, sorry, it's not here, you got to go somewhere else. That's what we put people through. So we make them jump through the hoops rather than trying to fix the system and us figure it out so that people who are vulnerable have an easy path to wellness and stability.
You have made me drop the mic. I've been in here ready to shout. I'm like, yes, and that's exactly it. You know, when I'm teaching, I usually have my students think about how many systems an individual in marginalized communities has to deal with on a daily basis. And it's so easy to say it's their fault when it is not. It is the lack of coordination. It's the bureaucracy that people have to jump through all of these hoops instead of paying attention, to your point, to the system that creates the barriers for them in being successful. So yes, I appreciate you saying that, because I don't think we pay attention to that enough. But one of the things that I think it's important to set the tone for in this conversation is providing the context in Los Angeles in terms of homelessness, because I don't think people really understand how big this issue is. And we talk about it around the country, but you all are dealing with some serious issues there. So set the context for people to see how vast this issue is.
Yeah, so Los Angeles has the highest number of unsheltered homeless people in the country. So if you look at New York, actually has more, but they have a right to shelter law. So people are inside. Los Angeles, about 75% of the homeless population live on the streets or in encampments. So it's very visual. The numbers here are about 60,000, but that's, you know, a point in time. That's one night of the year that they count that. If you looked at all the people cycling in and out of homelessness through the year, you know, it's, I'm sure, well over 100,000 people experiencing homelessness in LA. And the cause is not that 60 or 100,000 people suddenly said, I want to live on the streets and I don't want rules. And you know what? I'm a drug addict. And so I'm going to go and become homeless. The cause of homelessness, I mean, there are deep roots that go beyond the poverty and things like that. But the initial cause is the price of housing. You know, an average studio apartment in LA goes for about $2,300 a month. Okay, and what if you're on disability and you're getting $900 a month? What if you're a senior citizen? That's one of the fastest growing groups in the homeless population, are seniors who have worked their whole lives, retired on a pension, and suddenly they're told their rent is going up by 50%. And as it is, they're scraping by. That's what we're seeing. So we are seeing a massive humanitarian crisis in Los Angeles right now.
And how did COVID exacerbate that for you all?
So one of the first things that happened with COVID is we recognized that a lot of the shelters, for example, are congregate settings. So you have people crowded into single rooms. So we went, okay, that's not safe for anybody. So we did what we call decompressed. So we took a lot of those folks out, but we didn't put them out on the street. There's no way we're going to do that. So we rented hotel rooms. So ask about our budget for hotel rooms.
Tell me.
It's a lot of money. But again, we're not going to put people out on the streets. So we started to put people into hotels. We decompressed by about 80% in our shelters. But then what was good, it was interesting in LA, is it actually took a pandemic for a lot of the local elected officials to go, oh my God, we got to do something about this. And so we started seeing things that we had never seen in homelessness. So they rented all sorts of hotels in Los Angeles. The city did this and the county together. And we placed about 6,000 people in hotels with full services. So we had nonprofits running it with case management, medical, we had nurses on site. We did this incredibly successful. That has now phased into, that was called Project Room Key. They didn't want to just have everybody drop out of the hotels. And again, oh, great, now we've got them all back on the street. So that's morphed into what we call Project Home Key, where the city and county and state together purchased a bunch of hotels that now we're turning into permanent, temporary housing initially, but it's being turned into permanent housing. So that was the good side of COVID. The bad side of COVID was people on the streets. What were we all told? Stay home, stay safe. Guess what? You don't have a home. So we had a lot of people on the streets being affected by COVID. Food insecurity skyrocketed because all the faith groups that were providing meals, the volunteers that were providing, that all stopped, and suddenly people didn't have access to food. So there were some good things and some bad things, and we expect the fallout to actually come probably in another 6 months to a year, where we think we're going to see a lot more people becoming homeless.
And I don't think we recognize in those situations even our own privilege. I think about when COVID happened, my pastor talked about, we have a shower complex for the homeless where they can come in and, get haircuts and food and all these things. And there was a gentleman who wanted to take a shower. And my pastor was saying, well, it's not safe. We don't have the protocols. And this is very early on. And the gentleman made the comment, it's been 3 weeks since I've been able to even have access. And in that moment when he's, telling the story, I'm just stunned about, the privilege that we have. And we didn't realize how COVID for this population even exacerbated the situation even more so, and how more vulnerable they became because of COVID and what, had already been happening. But I think it also created this exposure to see how this has been a population that we haven't cared for before COVID and needs to do something even more now. And so one of the things that, you do a lot about and talk a lot about is equity. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we also pay attention to how equity is an issue even in homelessness. And when we think about COVID and the inequities that existed, especially for communities of color, what we do know is racism and sexism does not go away because a person is homeless. So talk about the challenges that you have seen based on race, especially for African Americans. What's been your experience, and how can organizations that are in this space pay more attention to equity, but also become anti-racist?
That's such a good question, and a vital question. Because one of the things, and again, I'll speak to the homeless sector, but one of the things that I saw when I first started working in this field is there was this acknowledgement that racism was one of the major causes of homelessness, actually the major cause of homelessness. And then everybody went, oh yeah, that's it. And then went on and just kept doing our work and didn't make any changes. But I think just like a lot of the country, there has been an awakening over the last few years that we can't just say that and then not do anything differently. We have to really grapple with issues of equity, and we have to stand. And I agree, we have to be anti-racist. We can't just say, oh yeah, 50% of our workforce are diverse, and isn't that nice? We have to put our money where our mouth is and call out the fact that racism is why we have homelessness. It is racist policies that still exist. It's redlining, it's discrimination in housing, it is criminalization and the war on drugs. And The war on drugs has hurt way more people than drugs ever did. And it was targeted at African American communities to a lesser extent, but somewhat to Latino, Hispanic communities. So what we're seeing around homelessness and poverty is communities that have been segregated, discriminated against, redlined, kept out of housing markets, kept out of areas where there's good schools and all of those things. And so we're reaping the whirlwind of the seeds that we've sown for hundreds of years in this country. And so what do we need to do? Well, we need to look at some radical shifts at all levels. And you have to look at it in nonprofits, because nonprofits can talk a good line about social justice and don't actually do it. So we have to have these very difficult conversations. I know we're having this in our organization, and it's not easy, and it's tough. We have to look at leadership from people with lived expertise of homelessness, people of color. This is conversations we're having in our organization. We need leadership. We need the voice of the people who have been oppressed. They need to be the ones to take the lead. We need to listen, have humility, be willing to be uncomfortable. And we need to push elected officials on policies and things that continue, and often underground. The stuff I hear about the homeless population is exactly the rhetoric that was used against the African American community for decades. And now it may not be politically correct to say it, but it's still being said about the homeless community, which is the majority African American. So I've had these conversations at the community. We don't want those people living in our community because crime will increase. My children need to be safe. It's horrifying. So we need to stand, and we need to be loud, and we need to proclaim this. And people like me, people of privilege, need to be willing to step back, to listen, to show humility, and to, again, do more than just acknowledge, but to stand up, stand with, stand for, and be anti-racist.
And I could just hug you because you're speaking my language. One of the things that was really interesting is my daughter was talking to me about, on our Nextdoor app, some of the comments that people were making about affordable housing. And they were saying things like, those people, I don't want them in my neighborhood. And so I'd like for you to talk about, this is something that's not just specific to Texas. I mean, it is all around the country, of this idea of not in my backyard. And so talk a bit about the myths and perceptions that people have about affordable housing and those in poverty. And I know this was an issue that you faced in Pasadena. So how were you able to address that? I know you talk about local officials and working with them and policymakers, but what were some things that you have done that we can take away and begin to start implementing in our work here?
That's a really great question. And yeah, NIMBYism, not in my backyard, is everywhere. And Nextdoor, don't get me started on Nextdoor. But I think what happens is people have a picture in their mind of affordable housing. And it is based in reality, in the sense that affordable housing, we all think of the projects, right? These big, massive cement buildings, no green space, crime, violence. That's the perception everybody has with affordable housing. Or you go into poor communities and maybe they don't look as nice as if you go into Beverly Hills. And so people immediately say, okay, that's what's going to happen when those people come into my community. One of the most important, this is a huge myth. This is a huge myth, and it's a hard one to fight. So some of the things that we do is we do a lot of sort of education, but we also talk a lot about the reality of your zip code and what is it neighborhoods are like. And people have the perception that someone moves in who's poor into your neighborhood, it pulls the neighborhood down. All of the evidence, all of the research says it just the opposite. It pulls that family or that individual up. It is the neighborhood that shapes the community and the individuals, not the individuals shaping the neighborhood, if that makes sense. So having affordable housing coming into a beautiful neighborhood lifts everybody up. And we show examples. We have examples. We have a building in Pasadena that we built, and oh, the fights to get, it took 7 years to get this building. It's a family building for families who experience homelessness. It was built. It is beautiful. It is by far the most beautiful building in the neighborhood. Looks like a beautiful condo. It's got outside space and playground space. We get people all the time wanting to rent there. And we're like, well, if you're homeless, what happened with those families? 19 families moved in. When they moved in, none of them were working or going to college. A year later, all of them either had full-time jobs or the parents were going to college full-time. It's a beautiful building. So we try to introduce people to that. And I love Brian Stevenson, one of my favorite human beings, writes about being proximate is one of the things we need to do. And so again, what we do with people is say, come and see, come and talk to people, come and experience what affordable housing looks like now, not what it looked like 30 years ago, what it looks like now. And the standards are incredible. So a lot of it is education, is showing people the results. We talk to our elected officials all the time. You love this, you pull this building out all the time, but then you listen to these people that say, oh, it's going to destroy our neighborhood. You know it doesn't. So we have done a lot of work as well with faith groups, because they are often a wonderful voice in the community, working with their parishioners. So we will get them very involved in our work, volunteering, education, and in Pasadena, which is our home base, we actually serve 32 cities, but we started in Pasadena. We have a huge faith community that understands about housing, and that housing is what creates a foundation, no pun intended, for people's lives. And so getting groups like that on site has been incredibly helpful. And it often starts with just volunteering and getting to know someone who was experiencing homelessness and going, oh my God, they're just like me. I'm like, yeah, they are. They're a human being, just like you.
But you've done an amazing job at building social capital, not only for the organization, but it sounds like even in bringing people into these communities and being proximate to each other, that they're building these relationships. Why is this so important? And talk about how these relationships and being proximate to each other can move the needle and transform communities, because I don't think we recognize often the power of relationships, and that even when people are moving into these communities, the power that you have to influence and to help and work together can really change and transform their lives, but even make your own community better.
Absolutely. And it truly is about relationships. It comes down to acknowledging the humanity. Somebody asked me a while ago, and we were talking about housing and housing first and services and all of that. And they said, what is it going to take to end homelessness in our community? And my reply was recognizing the humanity in other people. That is as simple as that. Because when we dehumanize people, when we other people, whether it's because of the color of the skin, their skin, where they were born, the accent they have, their ability or not, lack of ability or disability, all of those things, we other people, and then we are afraid of them. And I think so much of it is down to fear and ignorance, in the sense that we just don't understand. And then there's these myths that are built up in our, in our common narrative that people, you hear about all the time. And so to break down those myths, to break down that fear, is to be proximate. And like I say, we took our board, I have a wonderful board of directors, but they were very much kind of caring people. And they would volunteer by going into the kitchen and cooking a meal. And then our staff said, you know what, we want our board to really get it. And with their agreement, they were totally on board. So we didn't take them into the kitchen to cook for people experiencing homelessness. We took them into the dining room and sat them down with people, eating with them, and having a conversation with people who are living in our interim housing, our shelter. And again, the reactions we got to people, we heard people laughing, we heard people saying, oh my gosh, yeah, that's just like, yeah, me. And my board all came back and went, oh my gosh, that was transformative. So it's that kind of thing. The trouble is, how do you do that on scale, right? And that's what becomes difficult, is how do you scale those relationships? It starts with, who are some of your key people in your community? How do you draw those people in? How do you help them have the conversations? That's why the voice of people with lived experience is vital. I can tell, Sam's story, but it's way more powerful when Sam tells you his story. So we do a lot of work about us stepping back and letting people who've lived it speak. We pile in. Let me tell you, when there are city council meetings making decisions in our town, we load the room up with supporters, people with lived expertise, faith leaders, business people. We pack it so that lone NIMBY voice, I feel bad for them. We sit around them.
They don't stand a chance.
They don't stand a chance. So the YIMBY's voices are getting louder. That's what we need. The yes in my backyard.
Yes, exactly. So one of the things that fascinated me in learning about you and the amazing work that you're doing is the fact that you have contributed to more than 1,100 people who are no longer homeless. How did you do that? What did that process look like? And I'm hoping that as people are listening, they're getting ideas of how they can do something very similar here in Dallas, because it can be done.
Yes, it can be, and it does take a lot of work. A lot of work. The biggest barrier for us, again, is the cost of housing. So we have a whole team that does nothing but just find housing for people and work with landlords. We spend a lot of time building relationships with landlords because, again, there's that fear that landlords have. Oh, those people, they look dirty, they have to come off the streets. And so by building relationships with our staff and the landlords, they have someone they immediately can call. So regular landlords don't get that, right? If you have a tenant who doesn't pay rent, then you have to go, eventually you might have to go through court, and it's painful. With us, you call us and say your client was late on his rent check. We say, okay, we're going to deal with that. And we are there. And if there's a problem, the person's being too noisy, we're there. So we have over 200 landlords we work with, and they love us. We haven't lost any, even though we keep putting people in there. So that's a key piece of it, is the landlord engagement piece. And how do you build trust and relationships, and some incentives, some cash incentives, because we'll ask them to hold an apartment and we'll say, and we'll pay you while you're holding it, because then we have to go through all the bureaucracy to get the person in. So that's the first step. The other step is, again, relationships. What our teams do is they work out in the field. They go where people are. I've actually gone with one of our teams trucking through a valley up under a bridge, and they just build relationships of trust with people, because these people have been so abused by the system and given so many promises and asked to run through so many hoops. It's not that they're service resistant. We hear that all the time. That's not true. Everybody wants a home. What they don't want is to go through this horrible system that continues to abuse them. So my folks will spend time just getting to know them, talking to them, and what do you need? And what we find with so many people experiencing homelessness, they'll say, I need clean socks. Well, we think you actually need to go to the doctor. And the person says, I just want clean socks. Well, then I think, what about a treatment program for you? But I want socks. I don't have socks. And we don't listen to people. So our team goes, you need socks? We'll get you socks. Here's some socks. How you doing? The next time, anything else you need? It's like, yeah, I need, a shower. Okay, we will take you to a shower. Anything else? And this builds the trust. And then we say, can we talk about housing? Can we talk about getting you to see a doctor. We have a doctor that we think would be great. We also have doctors that go out in the field who are amazing, street medicine. So it can be a slow process, but I have a colleague who was himself homeless and then worked for 15 years as an outreach worker. And he said, in the 15 years I've done this, I have not met one single person experiencing homelessness who wanted to be homeless. That is a myth. People do not choose that life. They may not want what you offer them, but they don't want to be homeless. So it's about building relationships, and then it's about us jumping through the hoops, not the person experiencing homelessness. It is our job to deal with all the bureaucracy, all the stuff, all the things, make it as simple as possible for them to get on that path to stability. So it's hard work on our part, but it's so rewarding, because once we get people into housing, we have a 97% success rate. We are audited. These are all audited numbers of keeping people into housing permanently. So it works.
And you've mentioned some of the services that you provide, and I'd love for you to elaborate on some of the other things that you all do, but I know that there's a program you have that's called the Community Allies Program. Talk a bit about how that works.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite programs. And it's a volunteer program. And one of the things we recognized is that people, when they move into housing, you're actually taking them away from whatever community they may have developed on the streets. And now you're putting them into housing, and that can be pretty scary for people. And suddenly they have to start navigating kind of the life that for all of us is normal, but they're not used to dealing with that, right? Paying rent or, all of those things. And so our staff work with them all the time. We follow the person, we provide services. But what that person also needs is connection to their community. They need friends. If they're a person of faith, they need a connection to their faith community. And so we realized that our staff couldn't do all of that. It was just too much. But also it's important for a person to have someone that's not paid to do the work, but is doing it just out of love for their fellow human being. So we started a Community Allies program, and it's a volunteer program. So we get community volunteers who commit to being an ally with a person who is newly housed. So we don't do it with people who are experiencing homelessness because of all the trauma and issues. It's not fair to the volunteer. So once someone is housed, we match them. We go through a whole matching process, just like a dating site. And we do training of the volunteer. So we help them understand what are signs of trauma that the person may be dealing with, what happens if you're seeing something and you're uncomfortable. We train them, but then we match them and they commit. It's kind of like the Big Brothers Big Sisters model that I think most people know about. You have a buddy. Well, that's what's happened with the people who are in housing, and the buddy can just get together and go for a walk and coffee once a week, or it could be someone who says, "Leah, let me help you build a resume. Let me help you. You have a job interview. Let me help you do a mock interview." We offer those services as well, but when it's a friend. And we have one client who was struggling, and she was really struggling mental health issues. And we first met her, she almost was just like no reaction. You went, okay, there's obviously something this woman is dealing with. She was pregnant. We matched her up, we got her housing, we got her a buddy, and the buddy has become not only a friend but a mentor and kind of a mother figure to her. And this woman asked her to be at the birth of her child. She's now this child's like grandma. They get together, and this young woman, her life has changed. She's now an advocate and a public speaker. She's got a job. And we talked to her community ally, who said, "I got way more out of this than she did. It's transformed my life." And so that's what's so powerful. And it's not a situation of power. We are very careful. This is a friendship and a partnership of equals. And so, yeah, it's a great program.
But I love that as a part of that program, you're teaching folks about trauma-informed care. and
Yes.
how important that is. Can you talk a bit more about the role of trauma and homelessness? And then how can service providers take this into account when they're providing services or even conducting advocacy?
Yeah, that's such an important point, because trauma is one of, again, a driver into homelessness, and it increases when you're homeless. And we talked about racism. Well, the trauma of the intergenerational trauma of racism that people live and grow up with. It could be anything: poverty, abuse, all of these things, and they affect the brain, they affect how people react. People go into flight or fight mode. So when you see people on the street and you're like, whoa, they're not acting very, it's usually trauma. And again, it speaks to the mental health. Are all people who are homeless, do they have mental health issues? Well, they've all experienced trauma, but it's not like everybody's out there with some diagnosed mental illness. It's trauma. The good news about trauma is we know what to do to help people. And that's the trauma-informed approach that you mentioned. Said very simply, trauma-informed care is looking at a person and saying, not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you? What happened to you so that now you're in this space? And how do we work with you in a way that gives you back your power and your control of your own life? Because that's what trauma does. It takes away people's feeling of having any kind of power or ability to make decisions. So we work with people to engage with them, to empower them to make decisions, and we stay with them on every step of the journey. And we never blame people. We never go, oh my God, what is wrong with you? You know you shouldn't do that. We go, okay, this is trauma talking. Something triggered this person. We had an example of a client who got a job. We helped her get a job. She was doing really well. And then all of a sudden it started to fall apart. And we were working with the employer. And he's going, I don't know, she's just not doing well. It was a factory job. And we went in and we tried to figure out, because she'd been doing so well, and we're like, what's going on? Well, it turned out they put her on a machine that was quite loud, and she had like ear protection. But her trauma had been that she'd been in an abusive relationship, and her boyfriend used to literally hide and jump out and attack her, physically attack her. And so now she's in a noisy environment where she can't hear and can't see people behind her, and the trauma is just welling up in the fear. So we ended up putting in a mirror so that she could see behind her. She was fine. Now, I'm not saying all of the things are that simple, but that's just an example of trauma. So this is the approach we take with people, and we never look at people kind of falling back as, oh my God, they're failing, they're not doing what they're supposed to do, so we're kicking them out of the program. Instead, we say, okay, that's a trauma response. How do we work with that? How do you keep helping them move forward? And then one just other quick thing that's really important with trauma-informed care is you need to bring it inside your organization as much as outside. If you don't treat each other in the way of we're gonna interact with each other in these positive ways, you can create a very toxic culture that can then spill out. So the trauma approach has to be at every aspect of what you do.
You know, part of what you're making me think about is there's so many facets to homelessness. And I think it's so easy to label a population and stereotype and believe that this is only one face of it. And, you talk about domestic violence and that there are folks who have experienced that. And we talk about race. And, but there are populations that often we don't even pay attention to, and that's young people. And that we have a significant population of young folks that are couch surfing that may not necessarily be counted as a part of homelessness, but are. There's a group here, After Aid to Educate, that's been focusing on this issue, so shout out to them. But I wanted you to talk a little bit about the challenges that this population faces and sharing your experience with youth homelessness.
Yeah, absolutely. So one shocking statistic is and again, the foster care system, broken systems. And of young people who graduate out of the foster care system, so get to 18 or 21, it depends which state you're living in, about 50% of those young people will become homeless by the time they're 26 years old. 50%. The foster care system is a direct feeder into homelessness. Why? Because you've got young people, and most, there are some great foster parents, so don't get me wrong. And I had a foster sister growing up. I admire people who do this. But all too often what happens is they reach adulthood, the money stops, and they're like, okay, you're on your own. How many of our own children at 18 would have been able to, the morning they're 18, walk out of the house with no resources, no help, no support, nothing, and we say, okay, go get a job. What job? McDonald's? That's not going to pay their rent. That's not going to help. How are they going to go to college? I think it's about 3% of foster kids will end up going on to higher education. It's abysmal. Again,
Yes.
those who graduate out of the system. So this is a huge driver. And then there are other issues. LGBT youth, trans youth are highly likely to become homeless, often because families have rejected them. And so suddenly they're out there with little or no resources. So what works around youth homelessness? The approach to youth homelessness is different and needs to be different because you have a young population that's in transition in their lives. So we don't talk about permanent housing for young people like we do for adults, because what young person is going to be permanently in an apartment for the rest of their lives? Not. We also know that they need supports, they need adult mentorship, they need help getting into higher, education and job training. So a lot of our focus around that is trauma, because they have experienced trauma. But then how do we get them on a path that actually gets them out of the system? Because what you don't want, unless they have some kind of permanent disability, that they're going to need support, the best thing you can do for young people is launch them. So a lot of the work around youth homelessness is, again, around education, job training, mentorship, trauma care, and giving them the support and the foundation that they can then go, like all our kids, and be successful. And I always say that this is the group that I don't want to ever see again unless they come back as a volunteer or a donor years from now. I want them out there, out of the system.
As we talk about these different populations, I want to also help people understand veterans are also impacted, and folks who've been impacted by incarceration, and making sure that we are keeping them also at the forefront of our thoughts as we look at homelessness. But as we look at these different populations, one of the things that you make so clear is the importance of advocacy, that we have to have this hand-in-hand work around not only the services like what you're providing, which are amazing, the number of people that you've been able to transform their lives, but it has to be services combined with the advocacy piece. Would you share a little bit more about the advocacy, and what is the role of philanthropy and government in this space? Because they too have a role to play.
Thank you. That's a really important question. Just give me 2 seconds. I have really noisy family, and I'm just going to tell them to be quiet. Excuse me. The
And
joys
don't
of
feel
this
bad,
Zoom.
because I did the same thing. You didn't see it earlier, but I did a look. It was like,
I know they can't see me. They're in the kitchen, so I apologize, everybody, for the sounds of my adult kids making meals. So advocacy, yes. This is one of the things, again, that I've long seen in our sector is you have the people up making policies who, they see the forest, they don't see the trees. They see the big picture. And then you see all the people on the ground just doing the work, just chugging out the work. And they don't see the forest, they only see the trees. And I believe that advocacy has to connect those two pieces.
Yes.
So they have to inform one another. And so I used to be working in more of a policy systems work. And then I took on a job in direct services. And I remember talking to one of my funders because we talked about housing first and it works and it's wonderful and all of these great things. And then I talked to the funder and I said, yeah, but they didn't talk to you about bed bugs. They didn't talk to us about the day-to-day issues that we're dealing with and the bureaucracy and all of that. So I think that advocacy is really about, again, marrying the experience that people are having, talking about the root causes and what really has driven people into homelessness, and then working with our elected officials to say, this is the outcome of that policy. You think it may be really good, but what we're seeing on the streets is not so good. And this is what is going to work is us coming together and figuring this out, being informed by the people who are living it and working in it, and then what policy is actually going to have a positive effect. What's difficult is those of us who are working in the sector, the analogy I always use is we're bailing the Titanic out with a teaspoon. We're just trying to save people. The old picking up starfish off the beach and throwing them back. And we often haven't had time to do the advocacy, but I think we're seeing more and more that that's what's going to change things. We can work as hard as we want, but people are going to keep falling into homelessness. It's just going to be this constant churning. But if we can get the politicians and the policies changed, if we can rethink what we're doing with people, then we can see major effects. And it can start with some small things. We did in Pasadena inclusionary zoning. Pasadena was one of the few cities in California that saw a reduction in homelessness last year. And part of it is because they brought in inclusionary zoning so that you have to build a certain number of affordable housing units. So it can start small. Again, you want other than the usual suspects advocating for you. Because if I go, they know I do go. But when I go, it's like, oh yeah, we know where you stand. We know where you're coming from. If I get a board member who's a local banker to go, if I get the local pastor to go or rabbi to go, if I get Mary Smith, who's a homeowner and says, yeah, I want one of these buildings on my street, that's incredibly effective. So a lot of our work around advocacy is how do we get the community members to stand up? Because when we go, it's kind of like la 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 la. Yeah, we know. So it's so important, and now more than ever, because we're starting to see the tide shift in really not good ways around these issues. So.
As we get ready to come to a close, one of the things that I want you to give to us in Dallas as we think about this issue, what are some lessons that you've learned along the way in this space that you think will be very helpful to us as we think about community and reimagining the possibilities?
I think the first thing that's really important is to acknowledge people's fears and also talk about the fact that our intent is not to go in and change your community. And that's the fear. That suddenly the wonderful things about my community, the reason I moved here, are going to be lost. And I think those conversations are so important, that what we want to do is we want to maintain the beautiful heritage that is in your community. We want to make sure the parks are beautiful. We want to make sure that there's, recreation facilities, that historic buildings are maintained, that the green space is there, that there are trees. All of those things are wonderful. We're not talking about putting up massive buildings and just putting a bunch of people in them. What we're doing, though, is how do we offer what's beautiful in your community people who haven't had that opportunity. And it's going to, in fact, enrich your community, but we want it to be a conversation. And we work very closely, for example, with the Heritage Conservation Society in this area, because we want to be respectful of what's important to community and to them. And so what can we do in this community? What are the things we want to keep in this community, and how do we work with those things and enhance them? But also we have to stand very strong and very loudly for the bad heritage that communities have, for the fact that this community segregated people based on race, or kept people out based on race, and now based on housing status. Those things we call out and say are not acceptable. Trees, we will get behind. Racist policies, we will fight to the death over. So that, I think, is the first step, is meeting on that ground with people. We're not here to threaten your community. We want what's your community is beautiful. We just want to share it with other people.
I love what you are doing and how you are creating change on an individual and an organizational and a systemic level. Any final thoughts for us about what change can look like at each of those levels as we do this work in community?
I think what is so important is to, as we see change happen, is to, again, as I say, acknowledge people's tension, fear, discomfort, and have those conversations with people, and not be afraid to acknowledge that. But then we need to celebrate together. We need to celebrate the wins that we have. We need to, again, include people's voices and talk about the transformation in their lives because of housing and because now they're part of a community. We need to continue to allow those voices to be heard over the loud, NIMBY, yelling voices. And I think as we do that, and as we move into these communities and people start going, oh, okay, that actually worked. That's actually okay. Again, celebrate and broaden the tent of people who understand and who are on side. Again, be proximate, volunteer, have honest conversations with people, lift people up to be leaders who have strong and, incredibly powerful voices. And I think, build those relationships with city officials. It can be hard every time an elected official changes, you're starting from scratch. But you have to keep moving, and you have to recognize at times it's about building relationships and being positive and understanding. And at times it's about saying, no way in hell are we going to allow that to happen. And we will fight to the death on that. And knowing when to pull both of those out. I always say, I have a sign that one of my employees bought in my office, and it says, though she be little, she be fierce. And I think we have to be fierce.
Agreed. Wanda has in the chat, to help each other be the most and the best they can be. That's the ultimate.
Totally. That is it. And that's for all people.
Yes. And thank you for an amazing conversation. This has been wonderful. I want to just give such gratitude for who you are and what you are doing to make an impact. And I'm hoping that this conversation is just, I know it's one of many, but I hope that it is the beginning for us to really reimagine what possibilities could be for everyone in our community, and making sure that our homeless population, they are a part of that reimagined community and at the table to give input, to have that lived experience. So thank you for bringing that up and highlighting the amazing work that you do every single day. So thank you. I want to give this back over to our wonderful team at MDHA and allow them to have any final words and comments as we get ready to close out.
Wow, final words and comments. I'm speechless. I mean, that's my only comment. This is exactly what we wanted it to be, and even more. And I'm so thankful to Francois and to Anne. This is just a wonderful launch for what kind of community do we want to build in Dallas? And we're gonna take this message forward. And all I can say is whoever logged on and got this live, very good choice today for your lunch. And we're going to make sure that whoever didn't see it is going to see it. We'll put it out on all our channels because I think this is just an incredible conversation. So thank you to you both and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you,
Anne
Francois.
and Francois
Thank you,
and
Anne.
everybody
Francois.
listening.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.